Imagine walking into a market where what is for sale is not clothing, jewelry, or spices, but people. Strong men evaluated as if they were oxen, enslaved women offered as wet nurses or luxury currency, children marked for a future of pain. For centuries, slavery turned human lives into mere merchandise. But how much was a body worth in the slave market? What criteria defined the price of a life? In this video, you will uncover the cruel logic that turned human beings into numbers. Understand how the luxury of the casa-grande was built upon the suffering of the Senzala, and realize how those chains still echo in our society today. But the most disturbing part is not knowing the price they paid. It is discovering why, for many, a body was worth less than any other commodity. Picture the streets of a colonial city, the sun burning on the stone pavement, the murmur of voices, and at the center a scene that now seems unimaginable, an auction of people. Men, women and children torn from their lands, displayed in public squares as if they were animals. Slavery was not just an economic practice, but the very foundation of an entire society. The slave ship unloaded its human cargo at the ports, and from there, the bodies were moved to the markets. Each Senzala received new prisoners. Each casa-grande gained more arms for forced labor. The plantation master watched from a distance, evaluating muscles, teeth, scars, like examining cattle. The overseer, whip coiled in his hand, reminded everyone that any resistance would be punished with the whipping post, the pillory, or the shackles. The market scene was brutal. The crier announced the prices, the crowd inspected, and the enslaved trembled. Many came directly from the fetid hold of the slave ships, marked by the torment of endless nights, still carrying invisible chains on their wrists and ankles. Others had already felt the weight of the whip in the Senzala, forced into backbreaking labor that drained every last breath of life. In that space, pain was traded in gold coins, and the value of a body depended on cold, merciless criteria. The luxury of the casa-grande rose from this commerce. Illuminated halls, imported furniture, gleaming silverware, all financed by the sweat and blood of enslaved people. While plantation masters toasted with wine, the Senzala echoed with nighttime laments. Religious hypocrisy also prevailed. Many of those masters went to Mass on Sundays, prayed at ornate altars, yet kept men and women chained on their lands. The contrast between pomp and suffering was striking, and the memory of slavery still carries these contradictions. But the market was not only for strong bodies, for labor. Enslaved women were seen as multi-use commodities, for domestic work, for the kitchen, for forced motherhood, and even to satisfy the hidden desires of the powerful. Violence against enslaved women was not the exception, but the rule, and the female body became currency, a luxury good, and an instrument of intimate exploitation. This cruel and silent aspect further deepened the inhuman logic of the slave trade. The pillory square, where public punishments were carried out, stood only a few steps away from these markets. There, the bodies that did not meet their master's expectations were exposed to pain, serving as an example to the others. The whipping post, the whip, the shackles, these were tools of discipline and terror. Each scream echoed as a reminder that, in the slave system, the life of an enslaved person was worth less than the integrity of the economic structure that sustained the elite. Forced labor in sugar mills, gold mines, and coffee plantations all began in these markets. Each transaction was not just the purchase of a worker, but the signing of a sentence of suffering. Children were torn from mothers, husbands from wives, brothers from brothers. Families were shattered because, for merchants, a body was only a number, labor force, human merchandise. This profound dehumanization made the market of pain even more cruel. It did not just sell bodies, it destroyed bonds, erased identities, and forged a slaveholding past that still reverberates in today's social inequality and structural racism. Yet there was something even more disturbing behind this commerce. It was not only the explicit brutality of the whip or the torment of sleepless nights in the Senzalas. It was the calculated coldness with which the value of a human being was determined. Young and strong men were worth more because they could endure hard labor. Women of childbearing age had a higher price, as they could bear children who would also be enslaved, increasing the master's wealth. Children, though cheaper, were considered investments for the future. Every physical trait, every detail of the body was translated into coins. Slavery turned life into a spreadsheet and dignity into merchandise, and so the market of pain persisted. Amid cries, tears, and coins, the value of life was measured in figures. What was lost, beyond freedom, was humanity itself. The body became an object, the soul invisible, and the invisible chains perpetuated in memory. It was a macabre theater where life was not valued for its essence, but for its utility. But what truly defined the price of a body was not just the strength of its muscles or the youth of its years. It lay in even crueler and more secret criteria, turning life into cold calculation. Are you ready to uncover what those criteria were? Because if the most visible scene in the market of pain was the auction, what lay behind the numbers was even more disturbing. A detailed checklist that turned people into statistics. For each enslaved body, there was a cold, almost mathematical assessment that set its price. The plantation master and the merchant did not see human dignity before them, only physical attributes, age, gender, endurance, fertility. It was as if every enslaved person was a living inventory, and the more useful to the system, the higher the price in coins. Age was the first criterion. Young men between 15 and 25 years old reached the highest prices. They were seen as the ideal driving force for the sugar mills, the gold mines, and the coffee plantations. A strong body meant long years of forced labor, whips on their backs, and sweat in the fields. Older men were devalued, sold as second-rate pieces, destined for less intense but equally degrading tasks. In this market, time was not only life, it was price. Gender also carried weight. Men were priced as arms for heavy labor, but enslaved women had a value calculated in multiple layers. Beyond working in kitchens, fields, and casa-grandes, many were bought as wet nurses, forced to breastfeed their masters' children while their own went hungry in the Senzalas. Others were seen as concubines, victims of systematic sexual exploitation. Forced motherhood also entered the calculation. A woman of childbearing age was considered an investment because every child born into slavery automatically increased the master's wealth with no additional purchase cost. The female body was not only merchandise, it was multiplying currency. Another decisive factor was teeth. In the markets, buyers examined the mouths of the enslaved as if they were horses. Strong teeth indicated good health and greater resistance. Illness, scars, or marks from severe punishments lowered the price. Overseers and merchants knew that a body punished too harshly lost its usefulness, and so they preferred those who had not yet suffered as much. The cruelty was in the detail. Even whip scars were taken into account as proof of docility or rebellion. Children had a lower price but were seen as promising. They cost less at the time of purchase, but the return came later. They would grow within the slave system, molded from an early age to forced labor, never knowing freedom. This inhuman investment turned childhood into currency. Many times children were torn from their mothers in the Senzala, sold separately to other masters. Family pain had no weight in accounting, only coins spoke. Physical strength was assessed brutally. Men and women were forced to strip, to show their muscles, to walk before strangers who judged them as if choosing oxen in a pen. The slave market left no room for dignity. Every cold glance, every invasive touch reminded the enslaved that their life had been reduced to numbers. But there were also invisible criteria. Docility, or rather the capacity for submission, was measured by buyers. Enslaved people considered rebellious, those who had already fled or shown resistance, were cheaper since they represented risk. Those seen as obedient were valued higher. This logic reinforced the invisible chains of slavery. The more broken in spirit, the more expensive a body became. Behind this cruel table was pure economic interest. Forced labor in sugar mills and coffee plantations required resilient bodies, and every detail that increased productivity was converted into value. The torment of sleepless nights, the punishments at the pillory, and the tortures at the whipping post did not appear in contracts, but they were built into daily life. Masters knew that every coin invested would be recovered in liters of sweat, in years of stolen life. It was within this context that the idea of human merchandise emerged. It was not simply the purchase of a worker, but of a body molded to serve, to suffer, and to endure within a system of violence. Each sale was a sentence, and every evaluation criterion was another layer of dehumanization. The slave market did not just sell people, it sold the idea that life itself could be measured, compared, and tabulated. And so, auction calls echoed through colonial cities. Buyers raised their hands, coins clinked, and bodies changed owners. With every sale, the logic of slavery's past was reinforced, and its legacy still reverberates today. Social inequality, structural racism, and religious hypocrisy were fed by this commerce, which reduced human beings to market value. But if these criteria were already inhuman, there was an even darker and more silent price, that of the female body, transformed not only into merchandise, but into an instrument of pleasure, luxury, and power. Are you ready to see how far this trade went? Among all the horrors of the slave market, perhaps none was as disturbing as the destiny reserved for enslaved women. If men's bodies were valued for strength, women's bodies became currency of multiple uses: labor, reproduction, breastfeeding, desire. Every detail of their existence could be turned into profit for plantation masters and merchants. The female body was not just human merchandise, but also a coin of power and pleasure, reduced to an object within the luxury of the casa-grande and the pain of the Senzala. In daily life at the casa-grande, enslaved women were forced to assume roles that went far beyond domestic work. Many were cooks, maids, laundresses, wet nurses. Those who nursed the elite's children left their own in the Senzalas, malnourished, to feed the master's heirs. This cruel and silent practice turned breast milk into a transferred, commodified product, ripped from the intimacy of each woman. The female body was exploited even in what it naturally produced. Moreover, forced motherhood became an economic strategy. Every child of an enslaved woman was also born enslaved, automatically increasing the master's wealth. For this reason, women of childbearing age were more valued at auctions. Their lives were measured by the capacity to generate more lives that would be chained. This inhuman logic turned the womb into currency and motherhood into a tool of wealth accumulation. But there was an even darker layer: sexual exploitation. Enslaved women were constant victims of abuse, used as concubines without the right to refuse. White male elite power turned these bodies into extensions of their desires. And often, this violence was justified with religious hypocrisy. Some masters believed they had a divine right over their enslaved women. This practice left deep scars, perpetuated pain, and created entire generations of unacknowledged children born of abuse and silence. The enslaved female body was also used as social currency. In elite salons, some masters flaunted their concubines as symbols of power. It was as if sexual exploitation was not only private practice but also public demonstration of dominance. Meanwhile, in the Senzalas, suffering multiplied. Women were marked by physical punishments, rapes, forced abortions, daily humiliations. The pain of the Senzala was reflected in every gaze, in every invisible scar carried across generations. At the same time, women played a central role in resistance. Despite being exploited in so many ways, they preserved African culture, passing down songs, prayers, stories, and healing knowledge with herbs. In the Quilombos, they became leaders, warriors, mothers who kept the flame of freedom alive. This duality of being currency in the slave market and symbols of cultural resistance shows the strength and complexity of the female experience in slavery. Violence against enslaved women did not end at auctions or in the Senzalas. It continued in forced silence, in historical invisibility. For a long time, these women were erased from official narratives as if their pain were irrelevant. But the memory of slavery preserves their names and stories, even if often hidden. Every capoeira chant, every beat of candomblé, every rhythm of samba carries deep down the voice of women who were used, exploited, and yet resisted. It is impossible to speak of the female body as currency without understanding the hypocrisy surrounding it. Many plantation masters presented themselves as men of faith, supported churches and religious brotherhoods, but at the same time kept their enslaved women as concubines, fathering illegitimate children and perpetuating cycles of violence. This contradiction reveals how the slave system corrupted not only bodies but also the morality of an entire society. In the end, the enslaved woman was valued not only for what she could produce in labor, but also for what she could offer in forced silence. Her body was at once merchandise and prison, source of profit and of pain. And even when she managed to resist by fleeing to the Quilombos, she carried the marks of intimate exploitation and social contempt. She was circulating currency, used, discarded, but never forgotten in collective memory. But if the bodies of enslaved women were already seen as currency, there was yet another macabre calculation: the value assigned to children, small bodies sold as promises of future profit. Are you ready to discover how much a childhood was worth in the slave market? Among all the horrors of slavery, perhaps none was as heartbreaking as the sight of a child treated as merchandise. In the markets, among young men and women of childbearing age, there were also small bodies appraised with the same cold, calculating gaze. Enslaved children were sold as if they were seeds, costing less in the present but promising great returns in the future. For plantation masters, buying a child meant molding a worker from the start, with no roots of freedom, no memory of any world beyond the Senzala. The price of these children varied by age. The youngest were cheaper, as they did not yet have strength for forced labor, but precisely for that reason, they were seen as long-term investments. Raised under the weight of invisible chains, they learned from an early age to obey the overseer, to fear the whip, to carry buckets of water, to scavenge for scraps of food, to sleep in dark corners of the Senzala. Every stolen childhood fed the luxury of the casa-grande and the wealth of the plantation master. Forced motherhood also fueled this cycle. Enslaved women were encouraged or forced to have children, not out of desire, but because every birth meant new arms for labor. These children were not seen as lives, but as assets. Many times, before they could even speak, they were already destined for a mill, a plantation, or a mine. The overseer knew that in just a few years that child's body would become another piece of the system. The cruelty lay in the normality with which this was accepted. Childhood, which should symbolize innocence, was turned into a sentence of labor. Enslaved children suffered doubly. Beyond the weight of exploitation, they were often separated from their mothers. Many were sold to other masters, breaking family ties and perpetuating a silent pain. The cries of farewell echoed in the Senzalas, but they were never enough to move the market. What mattered were the coins, the contract, the promise of profit. This fragmentation of families was one of slavery's cruelest strategies. By dividing, the system weakened resistance and erased memory. Over time, these children learned there was no alternative. The torment of sleepless nights did not spare the young. Physical punishments were applied to discipline them from an early age. The whipping post and the pillory, instruments of adult pain, also marked the lives of the young. Any act of rebellion, any attempt to escape, even the smallest disobedience could result in lashes. The child's body was molded by fear and the mind by submission. This way, masters ensured that the future remained bound in chains. Yet enslaved childhood was not only passive. Many children, even while subjected to forced labor, learned the songs, prayers, and secrets of cultural resistance passed down by their ancestors. Among improvised games in the Senzala, there were also signs of struggle, dances that would later give rise to capoeira, songs that carried hidden messages, stories that kept Africa's memory alive. The child's body, even when exploited, carried within it the seed of resistance. The economic value of these children was also tied to life expectancy. For masters, it was more advantageous to raise an enslaved person from childhood than to buy an adult already broken by years of labor. Records show that many times children were sold in lots, as if they were wholesale goods. This large-scale trade fed the growth of the Senzalas and reinforced the cycle of dehumanization. Each child represented, in the market's cold logic, decades of future exploitation. The pain of a stolen childhood also extended to the psychological. Children who saw their mothers punished at the whipping post, who watched their fathers lashed, carried invisible scars for life. Trauma became part of identity, and yet many found strength to resist. In Quilombos, there were countless stories of young people who fled, who learned to fight, who grew up with the spirit of freedom. The enslaved future could also become a future of resistance. This aspect shows the cruelest contradiction. While for masters, the child's body was only merchandise, for the enslaved community, every child was also hope. With each birth, even if it was seen as profit by the master, there was also a breath of cultural continuity, a new possibility of survival and struggle. Childhood, even imprisoned, carried within it the flame of African memory and identity. In the end, enslaved children were proof that slavery did not only steal the present but also the future. The luxury of the casa-grande and the prosperity of the mills were built upon denied childhoods, crushed dreams, and lives marked before they even began. The memory of slavery keeps these stories as open wounds that still echo in society. Because when a child is treated as merchandise, what is at stake is not just one individual life, but the destiny of entire generations. But if even children had their value calculated as a promise of profit, there were those who chose to break this logic. And in the forests, hidden from the overseer's gaze, a space was born where the body had no price, the Quilombos. Are you ready to discover the true face of resistance? If the slave market reduced the human body to merchandise, the Quilombos rose as a living response, as territories where dignity was reclaimed. Deep in the forests, far from the overseer's gaze and the whip, entire communities were formed by those who refused to accept the price imposed on their lives. They were enslaved men and women who fled the sugar mills, the mines, the coffee plantations, and sought refuge in nearly unreachable places. There they built homes, cultivated food, practiced their religions, and rebuilt family ties that the market of pain had tried to destroy. The most famous of them, the Quilombo of Palmares, became a symbol of this resistance. Located in Serra da Barriga, in Alagoas, it gathered thousands of people. Under the leadership of Zumbi and Dandara, Palmares resisted colonial troops for decades. There, the memory of slavery was transformed into struggle, and the body, once reduced to merchandise, became a warrior, defender of its community. The Quilombo was not just escape, it was direct confrontation with the system. In the Quilombos, African culture flourished in secret. The music, the drums, the candomblé rituals, the capoeira circles, everything was preserved as an act of resistance. Capoeira, seen by masters as a simple dance, was in fact combat training, a tool of survival. Samba and other cultural expressions were born from this encounter between pain and freedom. Every song sung in a Quilombo was a cry of affirmation against the silence imposed by the pillory. Women played a central role in these spaces. While in the casa-grande, they were exploited as wet nurses, concubines, and invisible workers. In the Quilombos, they became leaders, mothers, healers, warriors. They preserved ancestral knowledge, cared for children, and prepared defense strategies. Dandara, Zumbi's companion, was an example of this female strength. She fought side by side against invaders, led attacks, and chose death over slavery. Female resistance, often forgotten in official history, was vital to the survival of the Quilombos. The Quilombos also represented a space of union between different groups. Not only escaped Africans, but also indigenous people and even some poor whites who rejected the logic of slavery found refuge in these communities. This cultural mix gave birth to an alternative society, proving that it was possible to live outside the overseer's whip and control. While the plantation master believed he controlled all lives with invisible chains, the Quilombos showed that freedom was always possible, even if it came at the cost of blood. But resistance was not limited to the Quilombos. Inside the Senzalas themselves, there were silent acts that undermined the system's structure. Enslaved people broke tools, slowed down work, hid seeds, and secretly passed down knowledge. Each gesture was a way of affirming humanity in a world determined to deny it. These small resistances were invisible chains of another kind, bonds that united communities and kept hope alive. The master's reaction was violent. Quilombos were constantly attacked, destroyed, and burned. Palmares, for example, was the target of dozens of military expeditions. Still, it resisted for nearly a century. This proved that no matter how profitable the slave market was, domination had a limit, the will to live free. Every destroyed Quilombo gave rise to others scattered across the territory. It was as if the flame of freedom could never be completely extinguished. The impact of the Quilombos goes beyond colonial history. They became symbols of cultural and political resistance, inspiring struggles for equality even today. In capoeira circles, in candomblé temples, in the beat of samba drums, the voices of those who chose to resist still resound. The memory of slavery is not only one of pain, but also of courage. The Quilombos are proof of this. They were spaces where the body regained value not through forced labor, but through the dignity of existence. The slave market tried to turn every life into currency, but the Quilombos proved that freedom had no price. This tension between market and resistance shaped colonial Brazil, leaving marks still felt in the present. Structural racism, social inequality, and the erased memory of slavery coexist with the vibrant cultural heritage left by those who resisted. It is a contrast that reminds us that history is not made only of oppressors, but also of rebels. But if the Quilombos showed that freedom was possible, there was still an invisible price that remained even after escape. The accumulated pain, the traumas, and the memory of entire generations. And it is precisely this human cost that leads us to the next chapter, the invisible price of slavery. When we speak of slavery, we often think of the price paid in gold coins, the calculated value of men, women, and children. But there was a cost that did not appear in contracts or auction cries, the invisible price of pain and memory. This price was not measured in numbers, but in physical scars, silent traumas, invisible chains that continued to bind entire generations even after abolition. It was the human, spiritual, and emotional cost of a system that turned lives into merchandise. Every lash at the pillory left marks that went beyond the skin. The torment of the night, when screams echoed through the Senzala, was not only physical punishment, but also a psychological tool of control. Fear was cultivated as a powerful weapon, and that fear became inheritance, passed from parents to children. Children learned early on that silence was a means of survival, that looking into the overseer's eyes could be dangerous, that forced obedience was the only way to avoid the whip. This environment shaped minds and corroded human dignity. The invisible price was also in the fragmentation of families. Slavery did not only separate bodies, it destroyed bonds. Mothers torn from their children, husbands sold to distant plantations, sisters sent to serve in casa-grande. Each separation was an open wound, a pain with no cure. This destruction of family ties created a deep emotional void, erased family histories, and disrupted the transmission of memory. Even today, many descendants of enslaved people do not know their origins because that history was violently interrupted. Another part of this price was daily humiliation. Enslaved people were forced to carry their masters' surnames, to deny their culture, to hide their faith. Candomblé, African dances and songs were prohibited or ridiculed. The slave system was not content with controlling bodies. It sought to erase identities. This cultural violence left marks that persist today in structural racism and in religious hypocrisy that marginalizes African traditions while profiting from them. The slave-holding past is not only historical, it breathes in today's social inequalities. The invisible price also appears in economic inequality. After abolition, millions of freed men and women were cast into misery without land, without dignified work, without reparations. The physical chains were removed, but the invisible chains of exclusion remained. Without access to education, without opportunities, many were condemned to structural poverty that lasted for generations. This exclusion was no accident. It was part of the calculated inheritance of a system that built the luxury of the casa-grande at the expense of the pain of the Senzala. And there was still the spiritual price. Many enslaved people saw their faith used as a weapon against them. Masters who called themselves Christians justified slavery with twisted biblical passages. Religious hypocrisy helped keep the system standing. At the same time, the enslaved found refuge in faith, in work songs, in improvised temples, in whispered prayers. A spirituality arose that resisted, that gave meaning amid suffering. This spiritual dimension, though marked by oppression, was also a source of resistance, keeping alive the flame of hope. The invisible price is also that of collective memory. Even after the official end of slavery, society tried to erase this history. School books often silenced the horrors, glorifying the casa-grande and minimizing the pain of the Senzala. This erasure was a second violence, denying truth, silencing voices, hiding wounds. But memory survived in songs, rituals, oral traditions. Today, remembering slavery is a form of justice, not only repairing the past, but addressing the present that still carries these marks. This invisible cost is what sets slavery apart from any other kind of trade. While an animal or an object ceases to exist once it is used, the trauma of slavery persists, echoes, and shapes entire societies. The pain did not end with the signing of the Golden Law. It transformed into inequality, racism, and exclusion. The invisible price continues to be paid, generation after generation, by those who inherited the condition of being descendants of the enslaved. And here lies the greatest irony. The plantation masters believed they had purchased only bodies, But without realizing it, they also purchased an unpayable debt, a debt not measured in coins, but in destroyed lives, erased cultures, and deformed societies. This is the invisible price, the cost that does not appear in records, but reveals itself in every statistic of inequality, in every act of racism, in every silenced memory. But the great question that remains is this: was abolition enough to pay off this historical debt? Or even without visible chains, are we still trapped in a past that refuses to pass? On May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, and Brazil became the last country in the Americas to officially abolish slavery. Many celebrated freedom, and the princess's image became marked as a symbol of redemption. But for the more than 5 million men, women, and children who had lived chained in Senzalas, the reality was very different. The legal end of slavery did not mean reparation, justice, or inclusion. It was only a change of scenery. The iron chains were broken, but the invisible chains continued to bind lives. Right after abolition, thousands of freed people were thrown into marginalization. Without land, without homes, without dignified jobs, without any state support, they were left to survive in precarious conditions. Meanwhile, the plantation masters, who had grown rich for centuries from forced labor, kept their lands, their casa-grandes, their privileges. The slaveholding past did not disappear. It only changed form. The social inequality born in that period still lives on today, reflected in favelas, urban outskirts, and the abyss between wealth and poverty. The invisible chains also manifested in structural racism. Even free, the formerly enslaved were seen as inferior. They were excluded from schools, public positions, and opportunities. Many had to continue working on the same plantations, now for miserable wages, under conditions not so different from captivity. The proclaimed freedom did not come with equality. On the contrary, it created a society where skin color continued to define each person's destiny. This legacy, built over more than 300 years of slavery, remains present today. Another cruel aspect was the erasure of memory. Official history preferred to exalt abolition as an act of royal benevolence, hiding the fact that it was won through resistance. Quilombos, escapes, revolts, insurrections, and movements of the enslaved were fundamental in weakening the system. The signing of the law was only the conclusion of a centuries-long struggle. Denying this was another way of enslaving memory, turning heroes and heroines into the invisible ones of history. The silence imposed by the casa-grande continued to echo. Even in religion, the chains remained. Catholicism, used to justify slavery, stayed dominant, while African practices were marginalized and persecuted. Candomblé, capoeira, samba, fruits of cultural resistance, were criminalized after abolition. It was as if freedom had limits. The body was no longer chained, but culture was still watched and condemned. This religious hypocrisy reinforced racism and kept the descendants of the enslaved in positions of inferiority. Abolition also left marks on the collective imagination. For many, the end of slavery was seen as a full stop, as if society had automatically become just and equal. But reality showed that the slave-holding past infiltrated every structure: the economy, politics, justice, education. Even today, descendants of the enslaved face barriers that were not dismantled in 1888. The invisible chains continue to tighten, silent but persistent. Yet resistance never ceased. Throughout the 20th century, Black movements organized to demand rights, denounce racism, and reclaim memory. The legacy of the Quilombos lived on, transformed into associations, cultural collectives, samba schools, and temples. Every space of Afro-Brazilian culture is also a space of struggle against erasure. Capoeira, once criminalized, is now cultural heritage. Candomblé, once persecuted, is now recognized as a legitimate religion. But the path to this recognition was marked by blood and resistance. The invisible price of slavery, accumulated for centuries, was not paid with the signing of a law. It continues to manifest in social inequality, in structural racism, in police violence that disproportionately targets black youth, in economic exclusion that keeps entire communities on the margins. Every current statistic is a reminder that slavery did not end. It only changed its name and form. This is the hardest chain to break, the one that binds mentalities, perpetuates prejudice, and normalizes injustice. That is why remembering slavery is so important. Not as an open wound to feed resentment, but as a living memory to prevent repetition. The slave-holding past shaped Brazil, and understanding this past is the only way to build a different future. The pain of the Senzala and the luxury of the casa-grande are still present today, in the stark contrasts between rich and poor neighborhoods, between those who have a voice and those who are silenced. The chains of the past still echo. In the end, abolition was only the first step. True freedom is still an ongoing struggle, a struggle against forgetting, against racism, against the inequalities inherited from centuries of exploitation. And every time this story is told, another invisible chain is broken. Memory becomes a weapon, truth becomes justice, and dignity returns to those denied it for so long. And so, the great revelation is that the price of a body has never been fully paid. Because it is not only about the past, but about the present that still carries its chains. And perhaps the most disturbing question is, how long will we remain bound to this invisible price? For nearly 50 minutes, you walked with me through the darkest corridors of history. You saw how the slave market turned men, women, and even children into mere numbers. You understood how the luxury of the casa-grande rose upon the pain of the Senzala, how bodies were used as currency, how dreams were broken, and how invisible chains continue to echo to this day. But now, in the face of all this, I must ask you a question. What if these chains have never been fully broken? What if, in some way, we are still paying the price of slavery in every inequality, every prejudice, every silence that still persists? The memory of slavery is not just a chapter of the past, it is a mirror that forces us to look at who we are today. Only when we face this truth can we transform pain into resistance, silence into voice, forgetting into justice. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share this video, carry this reflection forward. And above all, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. Because every new story we tell here is another invisible chain being broken. And you can be part of this struggle. Slavery may have ended on paper, but our mission is to ensure it also ends in memory and in reality. Together, we can turn remembrance into freedom,